Thank you. Thank you. Hey, we don't do this often here, but I think this morning I'd love to ask you guys to stretch your legs for a minute. And as you do, turn to somebody around you that maybe you don't even know yet, shake their hand, say hello. Now, here's why we don't usually do this, is because we as people hate being uncomfortable. But here's what I continue to learn, even about myself, who tends to be more introverted. What I hate more than being uncomfortable is being unknown. So go ahead, stretch your legs. And just turn to somebody near you. Just shake a hand, say good morning. Let them know that you are glad that they are here. What's up, bro?
Hi, Greg. How are you, man? We missed you, buddy.
Thanks.
Missed you.
So getting ready for hunting season, I bought a target bag for my bow recently. I was shooting in my backyard yesterday for the first time since I got it, and my neighbor, who, if you remember the story some time ago when I almost burned down my treehouse, that was the day I learned that you don't try to start a fire with gasoline. Happened to catch me, looked at me, and said, "Wait, didn't you already almost burn down your house once?" And then quickly proceeded back inside. So I was waiting for the cops to get called on me. All right, so this morning, that one's just free. I thought I'd give it to you. This morning, I want to start with a Russian proverb that I thought of in preparation for this morning's message. I heard this years ago, but I think it applies to today, and you'll see how. So here's how the story goes. And if some of you, maybe you've heard this before. If this isn't Russian, go ahead and correct me on this later, but I think this is where I heard it from. So the story goes like this. There's a bird that decides to wait too long to fly south for winter. And by the time it decides to fly south, it's flying solo, and it's so cold that it freezes midair, solid as a rock, falls to the ground. It's moments from death because it's frozen and can't move when it realizes it fell into a cow pasture. A passing by cow notices it and decides to relieve itself on said frozen bird. And then he begins to thaw. And as the bird begins to thaw, he's so excited that he starts to sing for joy, but then realizes that with the weight of what's on top of him, he cannot move and free himself from this new predicament. But luckily, there's a cat passing by. Nothing good's going to happen when a cat shows up. We all know that. And the cat heard him because he was singing and pulls him out and cleans him off and eats him. End of the story. The moral of the story is this. Not everyone who takes a dump on you is your enemy, and not everyone who pulls you out of a bad situation in life is your friend. And when you find yourself in a crappy moment in life, it's best to keep your mouth shut until it's over. You're welcome. I want to talk to you today about what has been one of the most important, but for me has been one of the most difficult principles for me to learn in my Christian walk. It is something I've had to learn again and again and again, and something that I feel like God is walking me through a season of even right now in my journey. And in a word, it is simply this, that our greatest times of spiritual growth, listen to me, our greatest times of spiritual growth will usually come during our crappiest seasons of life. Let me pray and trust that God will make some sense of all this today. Father in heaven, who according to your scriptures is also present here in this place, and is also somehow, and according to the writings of Paul, there is a mysterious reality that you are also in us. You hold all things in creation in your hand. You are in all places. You are in this place uniquely because there are a few of us gathered for your purpose, and yet you are also inside of us. And with all of your presence being so heavy and dripping in all of this place, would you be very clear and speak to us today? Would you help us, I pray, this morning as we dive into your scriptures to do more than go through the routine of church, but to find ourselves having an encounter with you. Father, whether we sit here this morning convinced you exist, or whether for some of us who are sitting here, we're trying to figure out whether or not you do, would somehow you speak to us exactly what each of us need today. And would you speak in whatever you say, what I believe is the message that you have been trying most of all to deliver from day one to us, which is that you exist, that we matter to you, that you gave yourself on the cross to prove that, to bring us into relationship with yourself. And I pray that we would somehow hear that and feel that and sense that today. In Jesus' name, amen. So years ago, I had this guy who was a mentor of mine in my life, and he was actually, he was my boss at the last place that I worked, the last church that I was at. And about 20 years ago, I'll never forget, it was at a point where I was still just getting to know him, and he was one of those types of people that, for me, played a significant role in my life. He was a mentor in many ways, like a spiritual father, almost like an idol in a lot of ways. Just really looked up to this guy. And I remember this one particular day, he had given a sermon, and afterwards I came up to talk to him about it, and just some of the things that, for me, it kind of shook loose in my own heart. And at one point, he says to me as we're talking, he says, hey, can I pray for you and the work that God wants to do in your life? And I'm like, yeah, given who he was, of course you could pray for me. So he puts his arm around me, and I'll never forget this. He pulls me in. It's this very tender moment, and almost immediately, these are the things that he starts to say. Dear God, I just pray that you would break Craig. I pray that you would just tear him down and destroy all the strongholds in his... And he's like praying this prayer that at one point, I remember as he's praying, like he's deep into it. His eyes are closed. He's passionate. His hand that's not around me over here is just waving all around as he's praying. And my eyes are open at one point, and I'm just looking at him. I'm thinking, who is this fool talking about God breaking me? What is he talking about? How about God break you? How about I break you? They don't pray for God to break me. So afterwards, I'll never forget, I actually asked him, I'm like, hey, can I ask you a question? Yeah. Why would you ask God to break me? And he says, because, and I'll never forget him saying this, until God breaks you, he cannot make you. And at the time, I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then, ironically, just a few number of years later, I feel like God took me into a season where I don't know how else to describe it, except immense breaking and difficulty. That I can tell you that in the midst of, while I hated looking back on, I don't know that I have yet experienced a season in my walk with God where he has grown me quite so much. There's a mentality that we have in Christendom sometimes that in pursuing Jesus, life will just somehow be better than if we don't. In other words, there will be less tragedy, there will be less struggles, there will be less problems, there will be less disappointments, and yet, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, then if you look at his example of his life that backs it up, if you look at the teachings of his disciples, if you look at the examples of their life that back up those teachings, what we see is something that in many times almost looks very contrary to that. Many times what we see is as a result of being a committed follower of Jesus, friends might reject you, family might betray you and mistreat you, health might leave you, coworkers might insult you, critics might criticize you, children might abandon you, a spouse might turn on you, tragedy may find you, and oftentimes chaos will surround you. So sign us up, right? Like, sign me up. There is a version of Christianity that in our culture, and this is important for us to understand, in our American culture particularly, there is a version of Christianity that we neither know what to do with nor do we often want to embrace. Because there is also a gospel of our American culture that we are all, to one degree or another, pursuing. And it involves three key things: life, help me out, and the pursuit of happiness. So what happens when in our pursuit of Jesus it seems like none of that is what we are experiencing? That's why, frankly, there's so many churches and there's so many pastors that are so quick to preach a gospel or a Christian lifestyle that's seen and experienced primarily through rose-colored lenses. But here's the concern that I have for myself, for us, if we're going to be committed to following Jesus, is that if we do not have a doctrine of suffering, in other words, doctrine of suffering, I would say something about this book has to instruct us on why we go through suffering and what God can do through it. If we do not have a doctrine of suffering, then when life falls apart, when things don't go the way that we expect, when relationships don't turn out the way that we had hoped, when a job doesn't come through the way that we thought it would, when our health begins to fail us, whatever it is, when life doesn't work out the way that we want, we'll usually conclude one of two things. Either A, God's making a mistake, like he's messing up somehow, or B, we are. And so whatever we're going through is just the consequences of God essentially punishing us for us messing up. If we proceed down either of those roads, the ultimate conclusion will be one of two things. Really, one thing ultimately, I think, is that we will just bail on the journey with God. And bailing doesn't mean necessarily that we physically go away. There are plenty of people I've seen over the years, and maybe many of us in the room have been tempted to or have been in this place where we're still going through the motions, right? We'll go to church, we call ourselves a Christian, we haven't given up the title, but emotionally we've just kind of shut it all down. If we conclude that in difficult moments, either God messed up or I did, and so he's punishing me, if you continue down that road, the end result will almost always be that you will shut down your journey. But I think that there's a third option. And I think instead of in difficult moments concluding that God's messing up because he doesn't, or concluding that you have and you're just being punished, which, listen, that's a possibility, right? The scriptures talk about the fact that God is a father. He disciplines those that he loves. So there are times that God knows, like a good dad, how, when, why to discipline us. That is a possibility, but I don't think that those are the only two options. I think so often the difficult moments in life, what could be happening is not that God's messing up. It's not that you're messing up. It's that the pain of whatever moment you're in is for a purpose, is that God is trying to prepare you for something more. And that's the story of a guy I want to look at for a few minutes with you. And this has been one of, for me, if I was to give you the 5 most important messages that have influenced my life over time, this is one of them. And this is one that I have needed to return to time and time again. And it's a story about a guy in the Bible who ends up becoming one of the most important people in the Bible named Elijah. And if you know Elijah at all, then you know he was a prophet. He was probably the most important prophet in the Old Testament. And Elijah, his journey begins, we're going to look at the actual entrance physically into the scriptures today, but I think his journey begins with his name. Elijah's name, if you know Elijah, you may know this, his name means Jehovah is my God. The word Jehovah is a Hebrew word for God, so Elijah's name literally means God is my God. And yet, God will take Elijah, and we're going to look at just a few of these moments today, not all of them, but God will take Elijah through a couple of experiences in his life where it would be difficult to not conclude that God is actually my enemy. So 1 Kings chapter 17 is where we're going to go. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and start flipping there. I'm going to give you a couple minutes so that you will have a chance to get there before I start reading. But I want to give you a little history and a little context first. So Elijah, when he makes his entrance into Scripture, he does so at a point where Israel, if you know anything about the nation of Israel and the history of Israel, they began with one leader. His name was Saul. And then Saul passed his kingdom on to David. David had some sons, and there were other sons of Saul, but they're basically insignificant. We're going to pass them. So you go Saul, you go David, you go Solomon. The kingdom is united under these 3 kings. But after you get past Solomon, you get into a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. You have Israel and you have Judah. Israel, which is the northern kingdom, ends up having 19 kings post-Solomon. All of them, according to the Bible, are wicked, evil men. All of them, all 19 of them. You have at number 7, you have a king named Ahab. Now, Ahab is the king that Elijah serves under. Ahab has a reputation among all the 19, even though when we're going to read, he's only the 7th so far. And his reputation, he's the worst of all of them. Like, that's his resume bullet point. I'm the worst king of 19. Like, he's just the worst king that there is. Now, a lot of times in the Bible, you'll read stories, and there are some even in these sections where you'll read stories where you have a wicked man, but they will at least have a spouse. They will have a wife who attempts to be a moral compass. And in this situation, you do not. In this situation, you have a woman that Ahab is married to named Jezebel. And Jezebel is as evil as he is, if not even worse. Her name has even become synonymous with just wickedness, brokenness, and deviation away from God's plans all throughout the scripture. So that was her reputation. Her name just became synonymous with betrayal to God and walking away from his plans. So Jezebel grew up the daughter of a priest of a false god, and as a part of that process, she then influences Ahab into the worship of a false god. So both of them together lead politically and spiritually over the entire nation of Israel. And in that they are themselves so bankrupt, they lead Israel into a place of being completely bankrupt. And part of what they do in this bankrupt process of leadership is they lead them away from the worship of Jehovah, and they lead them to the worship of a false god named Baal. One thing about the worship of Baal that you need to know that will tell you how broken this ideology is and their pursuit of him was, is that one of the ways that you worship Baal was to kill children, is that you would sacrifice them. And the way that you do it was even more horrific than just the fact that you did. There was a statue that would be constructed of Baal, and he would hold essentially a giant platter, and there would be a fire that would be lit under that platter. And these children would be thrown into this literal frying pan while alive and cooked as a part of a ceremony to worship and celebrate Baal. There are things sometimes that we read about in the Bible that are so horrific that you can separate them, even if you believe them to be true. You can still kind of pull them separate from reality a little bit. So take a minute and just let that sink in. Imagine somehow in our political process that part of what we did to celebrate a new president and to ask God to bless our country was to literally cook children in front of us. This is the broken nature of Ahab and Jezebel and the entire nation of Israel underneath their leadership. They're just a wicked people. Part of the reason that there was such a horrific way that you worship the Baal is because Baal was thought to be the god who provided rain. Rain produces water. Water sustains life. So if you're going to ask Baal to give the life-sustaining element of water, then you have to give life to him and give it in its most innocent form. So this is what you have to understand. This is the culture that Elijah steps into. And this is the reality that he's facing when God shows up to him and says, hey, Elijah, King Ahab needs to be confronted, and you're the man to do it. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and assume that if a guy has no problem killing children, he's probably going to have no problem killing you as a grown man who disagrees with him. So this is no small thing when God moves Elijah to go confront the king. Verse 1 of chapter 17, here we go. Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. So here's this king that God says has to be dealt with and has to be confronted. And instead of sending an army to go do it, and there are times in the scriptures that you read that to judge Israel, God would send an entire nation to do it. He doesn't send a nation. He doesn't send an army. He doesn't send a group of people. He doesn't send several prophets. He sends one single guy to go toe-to-toe with the strongest, most powerful, most wicked man in the nation that could possibly be gone up against. Here's what I wonder for some of you in this room. When was the last time you felt like God was asking you to do something that just felt flat out impossible to do or to accomplish? When I was growing up, I grew up in the church. And when I was growing up, I don't know why this is, but in my mentality, and I remember maybe you experienced this if you grew up in the church as well. There was this mentality that if God was going to ask something radical of you that was just crazy, it was going to be to quit your job and move to some foreign country and go into the mission field. You remember that? Like, that was always like, if you were a kid, like in my church, and like you were challenged, like, pray that God would do whatever he wants. That was always the fear in the back of your head. God, I pray that you'd use me however you want. I don't want to go into the mission field. Like, that was the fear. It's like, if God was going to do something crazy, he was going to send you to the mission field. But listen, what if what God has been asking you to do is not quite so dramatic, but is equally as difficult? And it feels just as impossible. What if it's to stay in a struggling marriage? It would be easier to walk away from. What if it's to figure out how to create some separation between you and some really unhealthy friends that maybe continue to have more of an impact on you than you do on them? What if it's, as we roll through the rest of the summer and start to head into the fall, as you to begin to see the campus this next fall that you're going back to, not simply as a place of learning, but that is your mission field. And to begin to ask, how do I bring Christ into my school? Or maybe it's, how do I bring Christ into my workplace? Or maybe it's to begin to ask you to trust him enough with your resources that you start to figure out, who can I bless with what little God has given me? See, God will oftentimes ask things that may not be so dramatic as quit your job and move to another country to become a mission. Maybe he is. Maybe there's some of you in this room right now that you feel like God would have you quit your job and go overseas somewhere. Or maybe there's some of you in this room that feel like God has called you into the ministry, but you don't know how to do that or where to even begin. But I think for most of us, it's far less dramatic than that. Not easier, but less dramatic. And God will frequently put stuff in front of you to say, hey, I know it seems impossible, but will you do it? Will you trust me and will you step out? And as Elijah does this, as he confronts the king, what does God make clear is going to be the consequences of this king's behavior? There's going to be years of a drought. What was Baal thought to be the god of? Say it again. Rain. So here's where you've got to get into God's head. He is literally going to go toe-to-toe with the deepest, most entrenched belief of these people. And in this is where their true wickedness will get exposed. Hear me say this. Their true wickedness is not the fact that they kill babies. That's the product of it. Their wickedness is that in their hearts they have come to believe we do not need Jehovah. Why? Because Baal is our God. And Jehovah is about to teach the Israelites, no, I am your God. And so Elijah does. He mans up and he goes to the king and he says to him what needs to be said. And in these moments, you would assume that when you do for God what he's asking you to do, that's when everything starts to work out, right? You would assume that, hey, when I'm obedient to what God's put in front of me, whatever it is, whatever that thing is that feels impossible, whatever he's put in front of me, you would assume that that's the moment that everything would start to work out for us. What we're going to see is that's not quite the way it works out for Elijah. Because this is where if you'll take my description of it, I think our Americanized Christianity begins to deviate from a biblical version of it. Because our American Christianity says this to us: if I do what God asks me to do, everything will work out. If I'm faithful to God, God will bless me in return. If I do what God asks me to do, then I will prosper in return. As a matter of fact, there's an excerpt I took offline just recently from a pretty famous pastor who I think kind of embodies what I would call our American form of Christianity. And this is a morning devotion that he put out that I think kind of sums it up. He says, God desires that you would be blessed and prosperous in all that you do. He desires that you would be so blessed that you can turn around and bless other people wherever you go. So don't settle for a barely get by mentality. Jesus came so that you can live an abundant life. And that means an abundance of everything: abundance of joy, abundance of peace, abundance of health, and abundance, of course, of finances. Now, you may not see it right now, and maybe you haven't experienced it in the past, but don't get complacent and just settle where you are. Get a vision for your future. Get a vision for what God wants to do in your life, because he delights in your prosperity. Can I tell you what else God delights in? What I actually find in the Bible that he delights in? Trials. And he calls us to delight in them. Jesus had a brother whose name was James, started out as a skeptic, became convinced that Jesus was who he said he was, wrote a book in the Bible by his name, James. And in the opening verses of James, one of the things that James says, it's one of the most quoted coffee cup verses in Christendom, is consider it pure joy. Do you know this one? When what? Various trials and tribulations come your way, because we know that the testing of our faith produces growth. One of the things that God asks us to embrace are the seasons when things couldn't be more painful, because he is at work. So here's Elijah. He steps into what God asks him to do. He confronts the king. He mans up. There's got to be a part of his mentality that's thinking, I don't know how, but God's going to come through. This is going to work out. Maybe Ahab right then and there will change his mind. Maybe he'll repent. Maybe he'll fall on his knees. Maybe God will just make me disappear from his presence if he turns into a snapping rageaholic. So he goes and he confronts him, and watch. Here's the response. Here's what God allows to happen in response to his obedience. Verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. So the literal Hebrew translation of that verse simply goes this way. Run, Forrest, run! Like that's what God says to him. Elijah steps up. He goes and confronts the king. He's like, I did it, God. And God's like, all right, they're going to kill you. Go, run. And he sends him. He doesn't just tell him to run. Like God could have intervened, and he didn't. And then he not only chooses to stay his hand from intervention, then he tells him go and hide. And not only go hide, but he sends him to essentially a Death Valley wannabe. The Kerith ravine is not a good place to go and try and live. This is a place where very little grows. There is not what is necessary to sustain life in the Kerith ravine. And so God tells him, I want you to go to the Kerith. Now, the Kerith ravine, you could understand all you need to know about the nature of it by the name of it. Kerith, it literally means to cut off. Why to cut off? Because nothing lives there. So God is sending him to a place where he's going to be cut off. Cut off from community, cut off from family, cut off from friends, cut off from resources. He's sending him to a place where he's cut off from life. I think oftentimes when God is trying to do his best work in our lives, he will send us to a Kerith ravine of our own. He will send us into a place where we feel cut off. And maybe some of you even feel like you're in a season like that right now, where you're cut off from a sense of joy that you once had. Or you're cut off from a sense of purpose that you once felt. You're cut off from a security that once made you feel like tomorrow was going to be okay. Maybe you feel cut off from a friend, cut off from family. Maybe you even feel cut off from God. You know, there are times in the Bible that I think God would allude to the fact that he allows us even moments and seasons to be cut off from him. There are parts of the Bible that tell us that there are moments where we will seek him and not find him. There's a verse in a book called Jeremiah that says, when you cry out to me, I'll answer you, but I will answer you with things that you do not know. In other words, it's like God's there, but he's mysterious. And there are times that I think God even invites us into seasons where it feels like we're cut off from him. And if you walk with God long enough, you'll feel that. One of the things that I hear often from people that have been in a walk with God for quite some time, I'll hear things like, I don't feel God like I used to. You ever felt that? Or I'll hear people say, I'm not growing here like I used to grow here. Or I don't feel like God's hearing my prayers and answering them like I felt like he used to. And so our tendency is to then try and create change. In other words, we want to get out of the ravine. We want to leave that place. And so we'll try and read the latest book that'll tell us of the disciplines that if we do, then God will do for us. Or we'll try and change something. Maybe it's this behavior. If I change this behavior, then it'll change how I'm feeling and what I'm going through. Or we'll change churches. Maybe I just need to go to a different church. I need to try a different place. And the reality is what I have found so often is God is going, no, I don't want to change. I actually want you in a place where you feel cut off right now. But the thing to be very clear about is that when God cuts us off, it does not mean that he's abandoned us. God sends Elijah to the Kerith ravine, but he doesn't abandon Elijah. What's the next couple verses make it clear that God is still present and providing for him? Verse 4 goes on and it says, you will drink from the brook that I have directed you, and ravens will supply you with food there. And so he did what the Lord had. Now, can we just point out that that's quite the miracle? They're in a season of drought, and yet in this ravine that's known to not bear anything good, God finds a place with water and sends him there. Not only that, but Toucan Sam himself is bringing Fruit Loops to him for breakfast and dinner. Like when the birds are, by the way, I don't know what that looks like. Like these are the moments of the Bible where you've just got to try and imagine, like, so a raven shows up, like, does he have a pork chop in his mouth? Like, what does he do? Like, what is he just regurgitating it? I'm a texture freak eater. Like, things make me weird if they don't feel right. So the thought of a bird bringing me food out of his mouth, but God sends a bird to bring bread and meat in the morning and in the evening, and he just happens to direct Elijah to probably the one and only place that's producing water during a drought. Like, there's some pretty miraculous moments. Now watch this. The next line is important. It has been to me. Maybe it will be to you. So he did what the Lord told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. This is it. And stayed there. I do not like staying in ravines. In the seasons of my walk with God, when he puts me in a ravine, the first thing that I want to do is get out of there. And I will look to everything possible to get me out of there. And Elijah chose not to leave, but to stay. He stays in the Kerith ravine, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and drank from the brook. Just because God puts you in a season where he feels like things are being cut off doesn't mean that he has abandoned you. And one of the things that we have to learn to do is look for the little ways that God is trying, even in the ravine, to prove to us his provision and his presence, because it's always there. The problem is that when you're in a ravine, you have a whole list of things that you want God to do. And usually he's trying to show you that he cares in another way. But if you don't look for the little ways that he's showing you he is there, he is present, he is providing, you'll continue to stay stuck on what you want him to do and miss what in fact he is doing. But at least there's reprieve, right? He's not in front of Ahab or Jezebel anymore. He's in a place where he's hiding, so there's a certain sense of safety. He's being provided for, so there is a bit of, even though he's in a ravine, there is a bit of reprieve, and then watch what happens next. You put the last verse up. It says here, verse 7. Sometime later, actually, would you just finish it? The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning. Then verse 7. No, go ahead. Go back to verse 7. Just read it. Sometime later, the what? The brook dried up. Like, you ever feel like God has a little bit of a sadistic sense of humor? Where he's like, hey, go do this. Okay, I did it. Run! Okay, I'm going to give you some meat and some of the birds, and we're going to put you by water. Hey, guess what? No more water! Like, wait a minute. The brook, that's all he had left was the brook. All he had left was the water, and now that's gone too. Have you ever felt like there was at least something God was doing while maybe other things weren't working out, and then all of a sudden, even that thing just went whoop and was just gone? Here's what's so important to take note of. Listen to me. Every single thing that Elijah is experiencing is the result of him being obedient to God, not being disobedient. Everything. The fact that he's in hiding, in fear for his life. He's suffering the consequences of an evil nation even though he confronted them. And now even what God was providing has dried up and gone away. All of it is not the response of God going, you've messed up, so I'm going to punish you. It is the effect of the fact that he has been obedient to what God has asked him. And yet God continues to put him into a difficult place of suffering. There's a famous Christian named A.W. Tozer. Tozer once said this on your screen. It is doubtful that God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. This is the biblical Christianity that most of us want nothing to do with. But it is almost the single solitary thing that I think will drive you away from God and it drive you away from all that he has in store from you unless we embrace the reality that God's greatest work is always about rooting out of our lives the places and the other things that we have made God more than him, that we have learned to be more dependent on than we have learned to be dependent on him. Why would Tozer say this? Why would Tozer say that until God would hurt you deeply, he cannot bless you deeply? Simply because I think until we're stripped of our dependence on everything and everyone else in this life, we will not live fully dependent on God. And until we live fully dependent on God, we will not experience the fullness of all that he has in store for us. This is what he's doing with Elijah. He's trying to teach Elijah to be fully dependent on him and nothing else and no one else. Even the things that he thinks he needs from God. He said, no. You don't even need to be dependent on the things I give you, just purely me. That's what the whole nation is struggling with. But God begins first with Elijah, trying to make sure that Elijah grows to a place that his name is not just a name, but it's his experience. Jehovah is my God. Because all of Israel has learned how to make so many other things their God. Not just Baal, their own pride, their own sexual desires, their own self-centeredness, like so many other things have become, at given moments to them, their God than God has actually been. And what Jehovah is trying to do is root all of that out of them so that they would realize he is their God. He is their provider. He is their sustainer. They don't even need just what he gives to them. They need more than what he gives to them. They just need him, period. You and I aren't all that different. At least I'm not. At any given moment in our lives, if we're honest, there's got to be places where we have made something else more God than God. And maybe it's a moment where we need to admit to ourselves that success is my God. Friends are my God. My kids are my God. My reputation is my God. Sex is my God. Maybe even my church is my God. And what God's work will always be in our lives, greater than any other work, is to root out those places from us so that Jehovah will be our God. So the next time you find yourself in a season where it feels like God has cut you off or dried things up, here's the question I want you to ask. And if you've taken no notes today, would you just write this one down maybe? Write it somewhere. You're like, I don't have a note sheet. Write it on the person beside you if they're going home with you. Next time you find yourself in a season where it feels like God's just cut things off or God's dried things up, you ask yourself this one question. What have I made God more than God? What have I made God more than God? Right now in my life, what am I making God more than God? And he's trying to remind me, no. That is not God. Jehovah is God. Because here's what I continue to find time and time again. The seasons of my life where I feel like God is distant, he's actually closer than he's ever been. The times of my life where I feel like he's breaking his promises are the times that he's trying to fulfill them. The times where it feels like he's taking things away from me, it is so he can give me more of himself. And the times where it feels like he is cutting off and drying up, it almost always has been my experience that those are the seasons that he is preparing me. God, I pray that Elijah's life would give impact to our lives, that it would give a message to us, it would give meaning to us, that it would have a word to us about something that either we're going through now or that may face us in the days to come. I don't want to define my walk with you on my terms. I want to understand it on yours. trust you and love you and believe in you, lean into you enough to conclude that in all things you are good, you are powerful, you are sovereign, and you are at work. God, I pray that you would help us to be a people that learn that in all things you are good, that learn that in all moments, whether they are dry seasons or whether they are seasons that feel cut off, that you are the God who grows us and changes us, usually through the most challenging moments of our life, so that we would know the fullness and the richness of your love, your sustaining presence, the essence of your power, and the purposes for which you have made us. I don't want to be a churchgoer. I want to be a follower of your Son. And I pray that you would help us all to learn to be that and to do that and to rest in the comfort of your hands more than maybe some of us are resting in the comfort of other hands. In Jesus' name I pray.